So throughout the Human Covenant War, there was plenty of planets that were invaded by the Covenant and ultimately conquered in their genocidal war against humanity, and they all seem to follow a relatively similar timeline, as these invasions were almost cookie cutter. So I figured today, let's talk a little bit about what it looks like when the Covenant invade a planet. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoy this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So throughout the Human Covenant War, the Covenant stumbled on countless human worlds, and each one was one by one systematically exterminated through a series of invasions and orbital bombardments that led to a widespread genocidal campaign against humanity. And this process, while dramatic, was basically repeated almost verbatim from planet to planet. So today let's take a look at exactly what this process looked like. So let's start with what's going on at that point in time. We're going to assume that this hypothetical invasion of a hypothetical UNSC world is at some point around the midpoint of the Human Covenant War. The population of this planet are well aware of the Covenant and the threat they pose, and the implications of a Covenant arrival on their world, and yet they continue going on day to day. Perhaps there are even invasions of planets relatively nearby, causing some concerns, but not necessarily outright fear. This hypothetical planet has a UNSC military presence, and it's relatively high as the front lines of the war are drawing closer and closer, with the planet playing host to a significant UNSC fleet in orbit and a large ground presence by the UNSC military, both Marines and Army. So, how exactly does this invasion play out? Well, first things first, the Covenant have to find the world. Now, they either stumble upon it by following cargo ships, or perhaps even being able to scrape some remnants of data from a purged UNSC navigation computer. But ultimately, they end up finding this world one way or another, and the first force that arrives at this planet would be a scouting force. A smaller Covenant force, usually designed for stealth, to get in to verify that the planet is actually occupied by humanity, and to scout for valuable assets, things like Forerunner artifacts, or maybe even key government and military infrastructure constructed by the UNSC. Now, nominally for the Covenant, this scouting operation is not detected by the humans present on the planet, and that the scouts are able to basically withdraw without ever alerting human forces to their existence there. However, this isn't always the case. In fact, this scouting party en route was detected by UNSC forces and engaged. But in most cases, the scouting party was able to slip away undetected and make way for a larger invasion force. The first elements of this invasion force would have been a Vanguard Force, which would have consisted of a handful of ships and some sort of poking and prodding forces. Their objectives are to just kind of poke the world's defenses and see what kind of a reaction they get. Now, this was pretty universal. A few Covenant ships show up in orbit above a planet, and the UNSC fleet moves to engage them. The UNSC fleet takes significant losses, but can manage to do some pretty significant damage to the Covenant forces that had led this attack. Now, this Covenant fleet would likely retreat before being completely wiped out, but more frequently, they would call for backup mid-engagement. So before UNSC forces were able to wipe out the still much stronger invading Covenant force, an even larger Covenant fleet would arrive, and this is the point when the battle in orbit quickly turns. With the UNSC fleet now outnumbered and outgunned by the much larger and more technologically capable Covenant warships, they're forced to either stand their ground and face imminent destruction, or retreat to be utilized in later engagements. And normally the policy of the UNSC would be to withdraw their naval forces, because those ships aren't any good to them in several pieces. So with UNSC forces having withdrawn from orbit, the Covenant are now able to achieve space superiority, but it doesn't immediately jump to glassing there. During the process of the space battle, the forces on the ground would have been focused on evacuating major civilian centers, the objective being to get as many people away from the advancing Covenant force as possible. However, it around this time would become clear that the battle in orbit had been lost, and it would become far more difficult for UNSC forces to escort these civilians off the planet, as many civilian ships would be destroyed in attempting to flee. But on top of that, things are about to get a lot worse on the ground, not from glassing beams from orbit, not quite yet, but from a Covenant advanced scouting force and invasion force. The Covenant would carry out a ground invasion in most circumstances. Now, this is an interesting tidbit, because the ground is the only place where humanity really stood a chance against the Covenant. In space, their military was vastly outmatched, but on the ground, while Covenant ground forces were still remarkably capable, the humans did have some forces that could really counter them. Now, the tasks of these Covenant forces would not be to overwhelm the entire human military complex on a planet, but to instead prevent evacuations and secure any Forerunner artifacts or key strategic elements on the planet that they would rather have intact as opposed to melted to glass. During this operation is where many of the ground combat instances would occur, with UNSC forces defending major population centers, for example, against a Covenant force hellbent on preventing an evacuation. This also leads to situations where UNSC forces have to defend large Forerunner artifacts that are now under siege by the Covenant, once again something we see during the Battle of Reach. With all of their crucial objectives on the surface of a planet secured, things like Forerunner artifacts and the evacuation points for human civilians, the glassing campaign can begin, with Covenant forces withdrawing from the surface of the planet for a series of orbital bombardments that eventually turn the surface of the world into glass. With the destruction of the planet, this marks the end of the Covenant invasion. While there's not much left for them to take resource-wise, they have achieved their goal of snuffing out another human colony and reducing the number of humans in the galaxy. Ultimately, this process would repeat itself throughout the duration of the Human Covenant War, culminating in the Battle of Earth, which is, as far as we know, the last instance where the Covenant tried to carry this out for the whole conflict. And if you'd like to learn about the way the Battle of Earth played out, specifically the space battle that came before the ground invasion, I'll leave a link up here to my battle analysis on the Battle of Earth. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments if you were a Covenant commander trying to assess the strategy, would you make any changes to it? Is there anything you do differently to inflict more damage on humanity in this invasion? Is there anything you would modify to maybe make it more efficient or more streamlined? I'd like to know your thoughts down below. And if you have anything else you'd like to see covered in Halo, you can let me know down below in the comments as well. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.